"Excuse me, that seat isn't for you." The words landed before the room even fully noticed him, sharp but polished, wrapped in the kind of politeness that didn't ask, it corrected. The glass doors had barely stopped vibrating from her entrance when Victoria Whitmore stepped into the boardroom like she owned not just the building, but the air inside it, her heels striking the marble floor in steady, echoing beats, each one measured, confident, practiced. She didn't rush, didn't look around to introduce herself, because people like her never needed to. The room adjusted to her presence the same way it always had. At the far end of the long obsidian table, Marcus Hale sat quietly, fingers resting lightly against the smooth surface, his reflection faint beneath the cold overhead lights, his posture relaxed but deliberate, like someone who understood exactly where he was and why. He wore a simple charcoal suit, no tie, no watch flashing status, nothing that demanded attention, and maybe that was the problem. Victoria's gaze passed over him once, then returned, narrowing slightly, as if recalibrating something that didn't fit her expectations. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she added, softer this time, though the edge remained, the kind that didn't cut loudly but lingered. No one spoke. Not the assistants along the wall, not the executives flipping through tablets, not even the man near the head of the table who had paused mid-sentence the moment she walked in. Silence spread, thin but heavy, settling into the corners of the room like something familiar. Marcus didn't move right away. His eyes lifted slowly, meeting hers, not confrontational, not submissive, just present. There was a stillness in him that didn't match the tension around him, like he was operating on a different rhythm entirely. Victoria took a step closer, setting her leather portfolio down on the table with a soft, controlled thud, her fingers brushing invisible dust from its surface before she glanced at the chair again, then back at him. "That's the CEO's seat," she said, a little firmer now, her voice carrying just enough to make sure others heard, to frame the moment the way she wanted it framed. Somewhere behind her, a chair shifted, the faint creak breaking through the quiet before being swallowed again. Marcus's hand slid an inch across the table, fingertips tracing the edge of a document he hadn't opened yet, his breathing even, almost unnoticeable, as if none of this required urgency. "I'm aware," he replied, his voice calm, unhurried, carrying none of the defensiveness the moment seemed to demand. It wasn't loud, but it reached every corner of the room anyway. Victoria's lips pressed together in a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the kind reserved for situations she expected to resolve quickly. "Then you'll understand why I need you to move," she said, tilting her head slightly, softening the command just enough to make it sound reasonable. The fluorescent lights above cast a faint sheen across the table, reflecting the space between them, that invisible line where assumption met reality and didn't quite align. Marcus glanced briefly at the chair beside him, empty, perfectly usable, then back at her, his gaze steady, almost curious. Around them, the others remained still, a room full of people choosing not to choose, their silence stretching, thickening, becoming part of the moment itself. Victoria reached for the back of the chair, her fingers resting on it as if claiming it through touch alone, her posture straight, confident, unquestioning. "We're already behind schedule," she added, a hint of impatience threading through her tone now, the first crack in her composed exterior. Marcus exhaled slowly, not a sigh, just a measured release, his shoulders remaining relaxed, his presence unchanged, like the pressure in the room hadn't shifted anything inside him at all. He looked at her again, not with challenge, not with submission, but with something quieter, something harder to name, as if he were giving her time to notice something she hadn't yet seen. His fingers stilled completely on the table. He didn't stand, and that's when the room felt different. Victoria did not remove her hand from the chair, her fingers tightening slightly against the leather as if the act of holding it there could stabilize the version of reality she expected, her chin lifting just enough to signal that she was not used to resistance, especially not from someone who looked like they did not belong at that end of the table. And yet Marcus still had not moved, his stillness now louder than any interruption could have been, the kind that forced attention without asking for it. And somewhere along the table a tablet screen dimmed automatically, forgotten, its owner no longer pretending to be occupied. "I am going to assume you are new," Victoria continued, her voice smoothing out again, refined, controlled, every word placed carefully like glass on a polished surface. So let me make this easier for you. That seat is reserved. She paused just long enough to glance around. Not for confirmation, but for silent agreement. For leadership. And the way she said it made the word feel like a closed door. Marcus's eyes followed her movement. Not her authority, just the motion, as if he were studying the pattern rather than reacting to it. And for a brief second the overhead lights caught the edge of his gaze, reflecting something calm and unshaken, something that did not shrink under her tone. He shifted his hand slightly, not away from the table, but closer to the center, fingers aligning with the grain of the surface, a small, almost invisible adjustment that carried no urgency at all. I understand the importance of seating arrangements, he said quietly, his voice even, not challenging, not apologizing, simply existing in the space between them, and that seemed to unsettle something subtle in the room, like a note just slightly out of tune. Victoria exhaled through her nose, a controlled breath that signaled the end of patience rather than the loss of it, and she finally pulled the chair back an inch, the soft scrape against the floor stretching longer than it should have, drawing every eye toward the moment she intended to close. Good, she replied, the word clipped, efficient, as if the situation had already resolved in her mind, and she gestured faintly with her free hand, a motion so practiced it did not even need emphasis. Then we are aligned. No one echoed her, no one reinforced the statement, and that absence hung there, delicate but noticeable. Marcus looked down briefly at the table, at the reflection of the ceiling lights fractured across its dark surface, and then back up at her, his expression unchanged, no irritation, no urgency, only that same quiet presence that refused to bend into the shape she expected. A faint sound came from near the doorway, the soft click of a pin being capped, then uncapped again, the kind of nervous movement that tried to hide itself and failed. Victoria noticed it, just for a fraction of a second, her eyes flicking toward the source before returning to Marcus, and something in that glance revealed the first hairline crack, not doubt exactly, but awareness that the room was not responding the way it usually did for her. We do not have time for confusion, she added, a little sharper now, her posture straightening further, shoulders squared as if reclaiming ground that had never visibly shifted. Please, take another seat. The word please did not soften anything. It only highlighted the expectation beneath it. Marcus's gaze held hers for a moment longer, steady, unblinking, and then he leaned back slightly, not to rise, not to concede, but to settle more fully into the chair, the movement slow and deliberate, almost thoughtful, as if he were considering something beyond the immediate moment. His jacket folded slightly at the shoulders, catching the light, revealing no sign of discomfort, no hesitation, only control. Around them, the air seemed to tighten, the kind of tension that did not explode but compressed inward, making every small sound sharper, every breath more noticeable. Victoria's hand remained on the back of the chair she intended to claim, but she did not pull it any further, not yet, her fingers now still, as if waiting for a response that had not come the way she expected. Marcus's voice, when it came again, was just as calm, just as measured, carrying no trace of escalation. Are you certain this is the seat you want? The question did not sound like a challenge, but it did not sound like compliance either, and that difference lingered in the silence that followed, stretching just long enough for someone near the far end of the table to shift in their seat, the faint rustle of fabric breaking through before fading again. Victoria's expression did not change much, but something behind it tightened, a subtle recalibration, as if she were adjusting to variables she had not accounted for, and for the first time since she entered the room, she did not immediately speak. The chair between them remained where it was, caught between being taken and being released, suspended in a moment that no longer felt as simple as it had seconds before. And then someone near the door cleared their throat. The small sound near the door should not have mattered, but it did, because it broke something invisible, the kind of silence that only holds when everyone agrees to keep it intact, in the moment. It cracked, the room shifted just slightly, just enough for people to start noticing what they had been pretending not to see. Victoria's eyes moved toward the source of the sound, a brief glance, controlled but sharp, and the young assistant by the wall immediately lowered his gaze, gripping his pen a little tighter, as if he had interrupted something important without meaning to, which in a way he had. When Victoria looked back at Marcus, the rhythm had changed, not dramatically, but enough to make her next words come a fraction slower. "Is there an issue?" she asked, though the question was not really directed at him, more at the situation itself, as if she expected it to correct itself if she named it out loud. Marcus did not answer right away. His gaze shifted briefly toward the far end of the table, where a few members sat unusually still, their expressions carefully neutral, their attention fixed but restrained, like people waiting for a cue they could not give. One man adjusted his glasses without actually needing to. Another tapped his finger once against a closed notebook, then stopped, catching himself. These were not reactions of people witnessing something routine. Marcus noticed all of it, not in pieces, but as a whole, like a pattern unfolding slowly in front of him. He returned his attention to Victoria, his expression unchanged, and for a moment it almost seemed like he might comply, like the tension might dissolve into something ordinary, but instead he spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying just enough to reach everyone without demanding it. "No issue," he said, then paused, not for effect, but as if considering the weight of the next words before letting them settle into the room. "Just a question." Victoria's posture remained firm, but there was a subtle shift in the way she held her shoulders, a slight tightening that did not belong to confidence, more to control, like someone adjusting their grip on a situation that was not behaving as expected. "Then ask it," she replied, her tone measured, though the smoothness now felt more deliberate than natural. Marcus nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and leaned forward just slightly, his elbows not touching the table, his presence still contained, still calm. "When you walked in," he began, his voice even, "what did you see?" The question did not sound confrontational, but it did not sound casual either, and that made it land differently, like it was pointing at something without naming it. Victoria blinked once, the kind of blink that buys time rather than resets focus, and her lips parted slightly before closing again, her answer not as immediate as it should have been. Around the room, no one moved, no one interrupted, and that absence of interruption felt louder now, more intentional, as if everyone understood that something had shifted beneath the surface and did not want to disturb it. "I saw a meeting that needs to start," she said finally, choosing precision over reflection, her words clean, efficient, almost rehearsed, and for a second it sounded like control had returned. Marcus's gaze did not waver. "That is not what I asked," he replied, still calm, still without edge, and the difference between the two sentences hung there, subtle but undeniable. Victoria's fingers, still resting on the back of the chair, pressed slightly into the leather, the material creasing under the pressure, a small detail that did not go unnoticed by anyone close enough to see it. She let out a slow breath, not exaggerated, just enough to steady herself, and this time when she spoke, there was a hint of something new beneath her tone, not uncertainty, but awareness that the conversation was no longer following her script. "I saw someone sitting where they should not be," she said, her voice firm again, reclaiming its structure, "and I corrected it." The words sounded right. They fit the situation as she understood it, but the room did not respond the way it should have. No nods, no quiet affirmations, just that same stretched silence, now heavier than before. Marcus tilted his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement, as if he had expected that answer. His fingers moved again, just once, tapping lightly against the table, a soft sound that seemed louder than it was. "And you were certain," he said, not quite a question, not quite a statement, "based on what you saw." Victoria held his gaze, her expression composed, but the pause before she responded was just a fraction longer this time, just enough to be felt. "Yes," she said, the word clear, controlled, but no longer effortless. Marcus nodded again, slower now, as if confirming something to himself rather than to her, and then he leaned back, settling once more into the chair without shifting his position at all. The overhead lights reflected across the table, catching the edges of faces, the curve of the chair, the stillness of his hands. No one spoke. No one moved to start the meeting. And in that quiet, the certainty in the room no longer belonged to her. The air did not move, but something inside the room had already shifted, subtle and irreversible, like a glass placed slightly off-center that no one could stop noticing once it was seen, and Victoria felt it without fully understanding it. The way the silence no longer supported her words, but instead waited for his. She straightened her posture again, smoothing an invisible crease along her sleeve, a reflex she had developed over years of controlling rooms just like this one, rooms that responded, rooms that aligned, rooms that never hesitated the way this one now did. "We are not here to debate perception," she said, her voice precise, measured, each word placed carefully as if re-establishing order through structure alone. "We are here to move forward." And she finally pulled the chair another inch, the legs brushing softly against the polished floor, the sound deliberate, claiming. Marcus did not reach for the chair, did not resist physically, did not interrupt the motion, but he did not shift either, his presence anchoring the space in a way that made the movement feel incomplete, like a sentence missing its final word. His gaze followed the chair for a moment, then returned to her, steady, quiet, unhurried, as if he were observing a process rather than participating in it. Around them, the board remained silent, but their stillness was no longer neutral. It had weight now, a collective awareness pressing into the edges of the moment. One woman near the middle of the table glanced down at her notes, then back up again almost immediately, her pen hovering above the page without touching it, as if writing anything would be the wrong choice. A man near the window shifted his foot under the table, the faint sound of leather against marble barely audible, but enough to mark time passing differently now. Victoria placed her portfolio on the table again, closer to the head position this time, aligning it with the edge as if positioning herself within the hierarchy she expected to hold. And for a second, she allowed herself to settle into that assumption, to let the familiarity of it carry her forward. "Let us begin," she said, turning slightly as if to address the room rather than him, her voice projecting outward, reclaiming audience, reclaiming control. But no one responded. No one opened a presentation. No one spoke her name. The silence did not follow her lead. It stayed where it was, centered around Marcus, around the space he occupied without effort. He leaned forward slightly now, not in challenge, not in urgency, just enough to bring his hands together on the table, fingers interlacing loosely, a gesture that felt less like preparation and more like patience. "Before we start," he said, his tone unchanged, still calm, still measured, "I would like to understand something." Victoria turned back to him, the motion sharper this time, controlled but no longer fluid, and there was a flicker in her expression, not quite frustration, not quite doubt, something in between that had not been there when she first walked in. "You already asked your question," she replied, her voice tightening just slightly at the edges, "and I answered it." Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the exchange without agreeing to its conclusion, and his eyes held hers again, not pressing, not retreating, simply present in a way that left no space for dismissal. "You answered what you thought you saw," he said quietly, "but I am asking about what you assumed." The word assumed lingered differently, softer in sound but heavier in meaning, and it settled into the room like something that could not be easily moved. Victoria's fingers lifted from the chair now, not fully releasing it, but no longer gripping it either, hovering for a fraction of a second before resting lightly against its edge, as if she were deciding whether to let go or hold on. Her gaze flicked briefly toward the others, just a glance, quick, searching for reinforcement that did not come, and when she returned her focus to Marcus, there was a trace of something new beneath her composure, a recognition that the room was no longer aligned with her version of events. "I assumed," she said slowly, choosing her words with more care now, "that roles are respected here," and the sentence sounded correct, structured, defensible, but it did not land with the same certainty it would have moments ago. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but there was a quiet attentiveness in the way he held the space, like he was allowing her words to fully exist before responding to them. He glanced briefly at the empty chair beside him, then back at her, and when he spoke again, his voice was just as steady, just as controlled, but now there was a faint shift beneath it, something deeper, something grounded. "They are," he said, not contradicting her, not agreeing, simply stating it as it was, "when they are recognized correctly." The room absorbed the sentence without movement, and for the first time, The weight of it seemed to press back toward her, not aggressively, not loudly, but undeniably. Victoria's posture held, but the stillness around her felt different now, less like authority and more like exposure, like the edges of the moment were no longer protecting her from what she had stepped into. Her hand finally left the chair completely, falling to her side, not dramatically, just quietly, and the chair remained where it was, no longer claimed, no longer contested, just present between them. No one reached for it. No one filled the space. And in that suspended moment, the room seemed to wait for something neither of them had said yet. Then a voice near the far end spoke up. The voice did not rise, but it carried, steady and clear from the far end of the table, cutting through the tension without force. "We should wait," the man said, his tone respectful but firm, and the effect was immediate, not because of what he said, but because of who he was. Daniel Reeves, senior board member, known for speaking only when necessary, and never without reason. Victoria turned toward him, her expression tightening for a fraction of a second before smoothing again, her posture recalibrating as she shifted her attention away from Marcus and towards someone she recognized as legitimate authority. "Wait for what?" she asked, her voice controlled, but now layered with something sharper, something closer to impatience than confidence. Daniel did not answer right away. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, a small, deliberate movement, then placed both hands on the table, fingers resting flat, his gaze moving briefly toward Marcus before returning to Victoria. That glance did not go unnoticed. It was subtle, almost invisible, but in a room this still, even the smallest shifts carried meaning. Marcus remained where he was, his posture unchanged, his hands still loosely interlaced, his breathing even, as if the moment unfolding around him required nothing from him at all. Victoria followed Daniel's glance, just for a second, her eyes flicking toward Marcus again, and this time the look lingered a fraction longer, not with recognition, but with the beginning of something else, something she had not yet named. "If there is something that needs to be said, then say it," she continued, her tone pressing forward, trying to regain momentum, to move the room back into a structure she understood. Daniel exhaled slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of care, as if choosing his next words required precision. "I think," he began, his voice calm, measured, "it would be better if we let this proceed in the intended order." The phrase was neutral, almost administrative, but it landed with weight, because it implied something had already been disrupted. Victoria's jaw tightened slightly, the movement subtle but visible, and she straightened again, her shoulders lifting just enough to signal resistance. "And what exactly is the intended order?" she asked, her voice no longer smooth, the edges now more defined, more exposed. No one else spoke. No one rushed to clarify. The room held its breath again, but differently this time, not passive, not uncertain, but waiting, collectively aware that the answer mattered. Daniel glanced once more toward Marcus, not seeking permission, not deferring, but acknowledging, and then he looked back at Victoria. "The meeting begins," he said, "when he says it begins." The sentence was simple, almost understated, but it did not leave room for interpretation, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, like a line drawn cleanly across the surface of everything she had assumed. Victoria did not respond right away. Her expression remained composed, but something behind it shifted, something deeper than irritation, something closer to recalculation. Her eyes moved slowly back to Marcus, and this time, the look was different, no longer dismissive, no longer automatic, but searching, measuring, trying to reconcile the version of him she had constructed with the one now being quietly affirmed by the room. Marcus met her gaze without change, without reaction, his calm unbroken, his presence steady, as if none of this altered anything about where he stood, or, rather, where he sat. The overhead lights reflected faintly across the table, catching the stillness of his hands, the quiet alignment of his posture, the absence of any need to prove or assert. Victoria's fingers curled slightly at her side, then relaxed, the motion small but telling, and for the first time since she had entered the room, she did not reach for the chair again. The space between them remained untouched, no longer something to claim, but something to understand. Around the table, the others remained silent, but their silence had changed, No longer neutral, no longer passive, but aligned, steady, grounded in something that had not been spoken outright, but was now unmistakably present. Victoria drew a breath, slower this time, more deliberate, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, not weaker, but different, stripped of its earlier certainty. Then perhaps, she said, choosing each word carefully, we should clarify roles before we continue. The statement sounded reasonable, controlled, but beneath it, there was an opening now, a recognition that something needed to be understood, not corrected. Marcus watched her for a moment, his gaze steady, and then his fingers separated slightly, resting flat against the table once more, a small shift that felt like the beginning of something rather than the end of it. The room did not move. No one interrupted. And for the first time, it was not waiting for her to lead. It was waiting for him. Marcus did not rush to fill the silence. And that was the first thing that made the moment feel different from anything Victoria had experienced before, because in every room she had ever entered, silence bent toward her. It waited for her to define it, to shape it, to move things forward. But this silence did not bend. It held, steady and unyielding, centered somewhere just beyond her control. His hands rested flat against the table now, fingers relaxed, not claiming space, not withdrawing from it, simply present, and the reflection beneath them remained undisturbed, a dark mirror that showed no urgency. Victoria watched him, her gaze sharper now, not dismissive anymore, but searching, trying to find something that explained what the room already seemed to understand. The faint hum of the air conditioning became noticeable, a low, constant sound that filled the edges of the silence without breaking it. Someone near the wall shifted. Their weight slightly, the soft creak of a shoe against the floor barely audible, and then stillness returned. Marcus inhaled slowly, the movement subtle, controlled, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm it had from the beginning, untouched by the tension that had built around him. Before we clarify roles, he said, his tone even, we should make sure everyone is comfortable. The sentence did not sound like authority, but it settled into the room like it belonged there. Victoria's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in resistance to the unexpected direction, and for a moment, she did not respond. Marcus turned his gaze briefly toward the assistant standing near the door, the same one who had shifted earlier, and offered a small nod, almost imperceptible, a quiet acknowledgement that did not draw attention to itself, but was felt anyway. Would you mind bringing a glass of water? He added, not as a command, but as a request, the kind that assumed dignity rather than demanded compliance. The assistant blinked, surprised for a fraction of a second, then nodded quickly and stepped out, the door closing softly behind him with a muted click that echoed just enough to mark the transition. Victoria watched this exchange, her posture still upright, but something in her expression shifted again, something quieter now, something less certain. She had expected confrontation, or at least correction, but not this, not a moment that redirected attention away from power and towards something so simple, so human. Marcus's gaze returned to her, not pressing, not retreating, just steady, and for a second, the room seemed to breathe differently, the tension loosening at the edges without disappearing completely. It is a long meeting, he continued, his voice still calm. No reason to rush discomfort. The words were ordinary, but the way they were delivered made them land differently, not as small talk, not as distraction, but as something intentional, something that shifted the tone without forcing it. Victoria let out a slow breath, her shoulders lowering just slightly, a movement so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if not for how still everything else was. Her eyes moved briefly toward the empty chair beside Marcus, then back to him, and this time, the look carried less certainty and more calculation, as if she were beginning to reassess not just him, but the entire situation she had stepped into. That is considerate, she said, her voice quieter now, less sharpened, though still controlled, and the acknowledgement hung there, tentative, unfamiliar. Marcus nodded once, accepting the statement without reacting to it, and his attention shifted briefly to the far end of the table where Daniel Reeves remained composed, his hands still resting flat, his gaze steady, offering no interruption, no reinforcement, just presence. The door opened again, and the assistant returned, carrying a glass of water carefully, placing it on the table near Victoria with a slight nod before stepping back. The glass caught the overhead light, a thin reflection stretching across the surface of the table, clear and undisturbed. Victoria looked at it for a moment, then at Marcus, and something in her expression softened, not fully, not visibly enough to change the room, but enough to change her. She reached for the glass, her fingers wrapping around it, and for a brief second, her movement slowed, as if she were aware of being seen in a different way than before. Marcus watched quietly, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle warmth beneath it now, something that did not challenge, did not correct, but simply existed alongside the moment. No one spoke. No one moved to take control. The room held its balance, delicate, shifting, and for the first time, it did not feel like a confrontation. It felt like something else entirely, something that had not yet been defined. Victoria set the glass back down gently, the faint sound of it touching the table barely audible, and when she looked at Marcus again, the certainty that had filled her voice earlier was no longer there in the same way. It had not disappeared, but it had changed shape, softened at the edges, made room for something she had not expected to feel. And that was when she finally noticed something she had missed from the beginning. It was not the room, not the silence, not even the way people had begun to look at Marcus that caught her attention. It was something smaller, something almost invisible unless you knew where to look, the kind of detail that did not announce itself, but quietly waited to be seen. And once it was, it changed everything. Her eyes moved past him at first, instinctively scanning the table, the documents, the reflections in the glass surface, but then they returned, slower this time, more deliberate, and settled on the small leather folder placed just inches from his hand. It had been there the entire time, untouched, unclaimed in appearance, but now it felt different, as if it had been part of the conversation all along without speaking. The embossing on the corner was subtle, pressed into the material rather than printed, and the light caught it just enough to reveal the company insignia, not the standard one used on presentation materials or marketing documents, but the older crest, the one reserved for internal use at the highest level, the one she had only ever seen once before, in a private briefing she had not been meant to attend, but had managed to secure anyway. Her fingers tightened slightly around the glass of water, not enough to spill, but enough to register the shift inside her, a small tremor she immediately controlled, her posture still composed, still upright, but no longer anchored in the same certainty. She looked up from the folder to his face again, and this time she did not look through him. She looked at him, really at him, noticing the details she had dismissed before, the way his suit, though simple, was perfectly tailored, the way his shoes were clean but unbranded, the kind of choice that did not seek recognition but did not need it either, the quiet precision of someone who did not perform status because he did not have to. Around them, the room remained still, but the stillness now felt like observation rather than avoidance, like everyone else had already seen what she was only just beginning to process. Marcus did not move, did not follow her gaze, did not acknowledge the folder or the shift in her expression. He simply remained present, his calm unbroken, his breathing even, as if the moment unfolding was not a surprise to him at all. Victoria set the glass down slowly, the base touching the table with a soft, controlled sound, and her hand lingered there for a second longer than necessary before withdrawing. "That emblem," she said, her voice quieter now, not projecting, not commanding, but testing, as if speaking too loudly might confirm something she was not yet ready to fully accept. Marcus's eyes flicked briefly to the folder, then back to her, and there was the faintest hint of acknowledgement. In the movement, not confirmation, not denial, just recognition that she had noticed. "It is an older mark," he replied, his tone steady, offering nothing more than the truth of the statement itself. Victoria nodded slowly, though the motion felt less like agreement and more like alignment with a realization still forming, her mind moving through pieces she had not thought to connect before, the silence in the room, the way Daniel had spoken, the absence of correction from anyone else, the way no one had stepped in when she first demanded the seat. None of it had been hesitation. It had been something else entirely. Her gaze shifted briefly toward Daniel, who met it calmly, offering no explanation, no reassurance, just a quiet steadiness that now felt deliberate rather than passive. When she looked back at Marcus, the distance between them felt different, not physical, but conceptual, like she had stepped into a frame she did not fully understand until now. "I was not informed," she said carefully, her words measured, each one placed with more awareness than before, that someone from that level would be present. The statement was not an accusation, not quite, but it carried the weight of someone trying to reconcile expectation with reality. Marcus tilted his head slightly, considering her words, and for a moment, the room seemed to lean into his response before he even gave it. "Information is often filtered," he said calmly, "depending on what people expect to see." The sentence settled into the space between them, not confrontational, not corrective, but reflective, like a mirror held at just the right angle. Victoria's lips parted slightly, then closed again, her breath steadying as she absorbed the implication, not just of the moment, but of her own role in it. Her fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the table, tracing the surface without thinking, grounding herself in something physical as the abstract began to take shape. Around the room, no one moved to interrupt, no one shifted to redirect, because there was nothing to redirect anymore. The focus had already settled where it needed to be. Marcus remained still, his presence unchanged, but the space around him now carried a clarity that had not been visible before, like a lens had finally come into focus. Victoria straightened again, but this time the movement was different, less about asserting control and more about regaining balance. And when she looked at him now, the assumption that had defined her earlier gaze was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more careful. She did not reach for the chair again. She did not claim the space. She simply stood there, aware in a way she had not been minutes ago. And that was when the realization began to settle in. It did not arrive all at once, not like a sudden shock or a loud realization, but slowly, piece by piece, like a puzzle she had been staring at the wrong way finally turning in her hands, each detail aligning with something she had overlooked, something she had dismissed, something she had not even considered important enough to question. Victoria's eyes remained on Marcus, but now they were seeing differently, not scanning for status, not measuring for hierarchy, but searching for confirmation of what the room had already accepted without needing to say it. The emblem on the folder, the silence from the board, Daniel's careful choice of words, the absence of correction when she first spoke, all of it threaded together into something she could no longer ignore. Her breath slowed, deeper now, more deliberate, as if her body needed time to catch up with what her mind was beginning to understand. Marcus did not move, and that stillness now felt less like passivity and more like certainty, the kind that did not need to assert itself because it was already established. His presence filled the space without expanding, anchored, grounded, undeniable in a way that did not rely on performance or recognition. Victoria's fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the table again, a small, grounding motion, and she noticed something else, something she had missed entirely before, the way the others were positioned, not just physically, but attentively, their bodies angled slightly toward Marcus, their focus naturally drawn to him even in silence, not out of obligation, but out of alignment. It was not deference in the traditional sense, not the kind that came from titles or introductions, but something quieter, something earned. She glanced again toward Daniel, and this time his expression did not offer neutrality. It offered clarity, not spoken, not forced, but present, like a steady point she could no longer pretend not to see. When her gaze returned to Marcus, there was no longer dismissal in it, no assumption, only a growing awareness that she had entered the room already behind, already misaligned with something fundamental. "You knew," she said softly, the words leaving her before she had fully shaped them, not an accusation, not even a question, just an observation forming in real time. Marcus held her gaze, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift beneath it now, something warmer, not in sympathy, but in understanding, as if he recognized the moment she was moving through without needing to guide it. "I knew what I was walking into," he replied, his voice steady, not defensive, not proud, simply factual, and that answer carried more weight than anything louder could have. Victoria absorbed it slowly, her mind replaying the last several minutes, not as isolated moments, but as a continuous line she had misunderstood from the beginning. The way she had spoken, the way she had assumed, the the way she had not even considered the possibility that she might be wrong, not because the information was hidden, but because it had not matched what she expected to see. Her shoulders lowered slightly, not collapsing, not weakening, but releasing something she had been holding without realizing it. Around them, the room remained still, but the stillness no longer felt tense. It felt resolved, like a question that had already been answered, even if not everyone had spoken it out loud. Marcus's hands remained steady on the table, his fingers relaxed, and for a brief moment, the reflection beneath them seemed clearer, sharper, as if the surface itself had settled. Victoria looked down at the empty chair again, the one she had reached for so confidently before, and now it no longer looked like something to claim. It looked like something she had misunderstood, a symbol she had tried to define without knowing what it represented. Her gaze lifted once more, meeting Marcus's, and this time there was no attempt to control the moment, no effort to redirect it, only a quiet acknowledgement that she was no longer leading it. "I made an assumption," she said finally, her voice even, but softer, stripped of the certainty that had once defined it, and the words did not feel like a defense, they felt like a recognition. Marcus nodded slightly, not affirming, not dismissing, simply accepting that she had reached that point on her own. The room did not react, did not shift, because nothing needed to be corrected anymore. The truth of the moment had already settled into place. Victoria's fingers moved away from the table, resting at her side, her posture still upright, but no longer rigid, no longer anchored in the same way. She drew a slow breath, and for the first time since she had entered, it did not feel like she was trying to control the room. It felt like she was trying to understand it. Marcus watched quietly, his presence unchanged, his calm unbroken, and the space between them no longer felt like a conflict, but like something else entirely, something that had not yet been named but was already taking shape. And then he leaned forward just slightly. Marcus leaned forward just enough to shift the balance of the moment, not abruptly, not with force, but with intention, the kind that did not need to announce itself to be felt. And the subtle movement drew the room in closer, without anyone physically moving at all. His hands remained on the table, fingers now lightly apart, palms resting flat against the smooth surface, as if grounding the conversation in something steady and real. Victoria watched him carefully, her expression no longer guarded in the same way, but focused, attentive, as though she had stepped into a space where listening mattered more than speaking. The reflection of the overhead lights traced across the table between them, creating a thin line of brightness that seemed to separate what had been from what was now unfolding. Marcus's voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried clearly, not because it was loud, but because nothing else competed with it. "Assumptions are not unusual," he said, his tone even, measured, without judgment, and the words settled gently into the space, not sharp, not corrective, but undeniable in their simplicity. Victoria held his gaze, absorbing the statement, and for a moment, it seemed like she might respond immediately, but she did not, her breath slowing, her posture adjusting, not shrinking, but recalibrating in a way that felt more grounded than before. Around the table, the others remained still, but their stillness now felt like attention rather than restraint, like they were witnessing something that did not require interruption. Marcus continued, his voice steady. "What matters is what follows them." And that sentence lingered longer, not because it was complex, but because it invited something, not confrontation, but reflection. Victoria's eyes lowered briefly, not in submission, but in thought, her mind moving through the moments that had just passed, replaying them with a clarity she had not had while they were happening. The way she had entered, the certainty in her voice, the assumption in her tone, the dismissal in her gaze, all of it now felt different when viewed through this new lens, not just incorrect, but incomplete. Her fingers moved slightly at her side, then stilled again, the small motion grounding her in the present as she looked back up at him. "Then what follows this," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "should be clarity." Her voice was steady, but softer now, less about control and more about understanding, and the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and for a brief moment, something warmer passed through his expression, not approval, not relief, just recognition of the space she had stepped into. Clarity is a good place to start, he replied, and there was no weight behind the words beyond their truth. No hidden meaning, no layered implication, just a quiet agreement that allowed the moment to move forward without forcing it. Victoria drew a slow breath, her shoulders settling, and for the first time since she had entered the room, her stance did not feel like it was bracing against something. She glanced once more at the chair beside him, then back at him, and this time, the look carried no claim, no assumption, only awareness. "Then I will ask directly," she said, her tone composed, respectful, not lowered, but aligned differently. "What is your role here?" The question did not challenge, it invited, and that distinction changed everything about how it landed in the room. Marcus held her gaze for a moment, and in that pause, there was no tension, no hesitation, just a quiet understanding that the moment had reached a point where truth would no longer disrupt anything. It would simply reveal what was already present. Around them, the room seemed to settle even further, the faint sounds that had once marked discomfort now absent, replaced by a stillness that felt complete rather than strained. Daniel remained motionless, his attention steady, offering no interference, no reinforcement, because none was needed anymore. Marcus's fingers moved slightly against the table, a small, deliberate motion, and then stilled again as he prepared to answer, not with urgency, not with emphasis, but with the same calm that had carried him through the entire exchange. Victoria watched him closely, her expression open now, no longer filtered through expectation, but through understanding, ready to receive whatever came next without shaping it in advance. The space between them no longer felt like a divide, but like a point of connection, quiet, steady, real. Marcus drew a slow breath, his posture unchanged, his presence grounded, and just before he spoke, the room seemed to lean into the moment without moving. And then he said something that shifted everything again. Marcus did not raise his voice, did not shift his posture, did not reach for anything that would signal authority in the way Victoria had been trained to recognize it. And that was what made the moment feel so precise, so controlled, like everything unnecessary had been removed, leaving only what mattered. His eyes remained on hers, steady, unblinking, not to intimidate, not to assert, but to hold the space long enough for the truth to land without resistance. "I am the one who signs the final decisions," he said, his tone even, almost quiet, but the weight of the words did not depend on volume. It settled into the room immediately, threading through the silence that followed like something that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. Victoria did not move. Not right away. Her expression remained composed, but something beneath it shifted, not abruptly, not dramatically, but undeniably, like the ground beneath a structure adjusting just enough to be felt through the walls. Her eyes stayed on him, searching for something that might soften or redirect what he had just said, but there was nothing in his expression that offered that. No performance, no emphasis, no need to convince. Around the table, no one reacted outwardly, but the stillness deepened, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, like a confirmation that required no discussion. Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, not in avoidance, but in acknowledgement, a quiet gesture that aligned with what had just been spoken without needing to reinforce it. Victoria's fingers moved slightly at her side, then stilled again, her breath steady but slower now, as if her body was adjusting to a new rhythm she had not anticipated. "That is not a title," she said after a moment, her voice controlled, but quieter, less certain than before, not challenging, but clarifying, as if she needed to understand the structure of what he was saying before she could fully accept it. Marcus nodded once, a small movement, and there was no hesitation in his response. "No," he said simply, "it is not." The simplicity of the answer removed any ambiguity, and that was what made it land more deeply, because it did not rely on explanation, it did not expand, it just existed. Victoria's gaze flicked briefly to the folder again, the embossed crest catching the light in a way that now felt unmistakable, and then back to him, her mind moving through the implications with increasing clarity. The room remained quiet, but the silence no longer felt like something that needed to be broken. It felt complete, like the moment had reached its center. "Then you are saying," she continued, her words slower now, more deliberate, "that you are responsible for this entire operation." The sentence was careful, structured, but beneath it was the beginning of something else, something closer to realization than inquiry. Marcus did not shift, did not lean forward or back, did not change his tone. "I am saying," he replied, his voice steady, "that everything in this room moves when I decide it does." There was no emphasis on the last word, no attempt to underline it, but it settled into the space with quiet finality, not as a threat, not as a display, but as a fact that did not require validation. Victoria held his gaze, and for the first time, there was no immediate response forming behind her eyes, no quick alignment of words ready to follow, only a pause, a real one, where thought caught up with understanding. Her shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in adjustment, the kind that happens when something internal shifts into a new position. Around them, the board remained still, but their stillness now felt like alignment rather than observation, like they were not watching something unfold, they were simply present within it. Victoria's lips parted slightly, then closed again, her breath steadying as she processed what had just been said, not just the words, but everything they reframed about the last several minutes. The chair beside him remained untouched, no longer an object of assumption, but a marker of something she had misunderstood completely. Her gaze moved once more to the table, to the reflection of the lights, to the subtle placement of his hands, and then back to him. And when she spoke again, her voice had changed, not weakened, not diminished, but grounded in something more real than before. "I see," she said quietly, and the words were not a concession, not an apology, just an acknowledgement that something had become clear. Marcus watched her, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift beneath it, something that recognized the moment she had reached without needing to comment on it. No one else spoke. No one moved to fill the space. The room held steady, balanced, as if everything had settled into its proper place. Victoria stood there, no longer reaching for control, no longer shaping the moment, but standing within it, aware in a way she had not been when she entered. And for a brief second, the silence felt almost gentle. Then she asked one more question. Victoria did not speak immediately, and that pause carried more meaning than anything she could have said too quickly, because for the first time since she had entered the room, she was not trying to stay ahead of the moment, she was allowing it to fully arrive. Her eyes remained on Marcus, steady now, not searching for flaws, not measuring for status, but holding the reality of what he had just said, letting it settle without resistance. The faint reflection of the overhead lights moved slightly across the table as someone shifted almost imperceptibly in their seat, but the room itself remained quiet, attentive, aligned around something that no longer needed to be proven. Victoria drew a slow breath, her shoulders lowering just enough to release the last trace of tension that had been holding her posture rigid, and when she finally spoke, her voice was different, not smaller, not weaker, but grounded in something more honest than before. "Why did you not say it earlier?" she asked, her tone calm, not accusing, not defensive, but genuinely seeking understanding, and the question did not challenge him. It opened a space between them. Marcus watched her for a moment, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle warmth beneath it now, not directed at her specifically, but at the moment itself, at the shift that had taken place. Without force, his fingers moved slightly against the table, then stilled again, and when he answered, his voice remained steady, measured, carrying no weight beyond the truth it held. "Because I wanted to see what would happen if I did not," he said, and the words did not carry judgment, but they carried clarity, the kind that reflected rather than corrected. Victoria absorbed the answer slowly, her gaze dropping briefly to the table, to the reflection of her own hand resting lightly against its surface. And for a moment, she saw the scene from a distance, not as the person directing it, but as someone within it, someone who had acted without fully seeing. Her fingers curled slightly, then relaxed, and when she looked back up at him, there was no trace of the earlier certainty that had defined her, only awareness, and something quieter beneath it, something closer to humility than she was used to showing in a room like this. "And what did happen?" she continued, her voice still calm, but now more deliberate, "was not what it should have been." The statement was not dramatic, not framed for effect. It was simple, direct, and it landed with more weight because of that. Around the table, no one reacted outwardly, but the silence acknowledged it, not as a disruption, but as a continuation of the moment. Marcus nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and there was no sense of victory in it, no satisfaction, only recognition that she had reached a point he had not forced her toward. No, he replied quietly, it was not. The agreement did not escalate anything. It did not prolong the tension. It allowed it to settle, to resolve in a way that did not require confrontation. Victoria's gaze shifted briefly toward the empty chair again, then back to him. And this time, the look held no claim, no confusion, only understanding of what it represented now, not a position to take, but a moment she had misread. She drew another breath, slower this time, and for the first time, there was a softness in her expression that did not come from uncertainty, but from clarity, from seeing something she had not allowed herself to see before. Then I was wrong, she said, the words steady, unembellished, and they did not feel like a loss. They felt like a correction, like something being placed back where it belonged. The room remained quiet, but the silence now felt lighter, not because something had ended, but because something had been understood. Marcus held her gaze, his expression unchanged, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in it, not approval, not judgment, simply acceptance of the truth she had spoken. He did not respond immediately, and that pause allowed the moment to breathe, to exist fully without being rushed into the next step. Victoria's posture remained upright, but it no longer carried the same rigid control. It felt balanced now, grounded in something real rather than assumed. Her hands rested naturally at her sides, no longer reaching, no longer holding, and for the first time since she had entered, she was not trying to shape the room around her. Marcus leaned back slightly, a small shift that did not change his presence, only the angle of it, and his voice, when it came again, was just as calm, just as steady. What matters now, he said, is what you do with that. The sentence did not press, did not demand, it offered, and the space it created was different from anything that had come before, open, quiet, waiting. Victoria listened, her gaze steady, her breath even, and something in her expression settled into place, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a kind of quiet certainty that had not been there before. She did not look away. She did not retreat. She remained exactly where she was, fully present in the moment she had stepped into. And then she made a choice. Victoria did not rush the moment, and that alone marked the difference between who she had been when she entered and who she was choosing to be now, because this time, she allowed the silence to hold her instead of trying to control it. Her gaze remained on Marcus, steady, clear, not searching for advantage, not measuring for leverage, but present in a way that acknowledged everything that had unfolded without needing to undo it. The faint hum of the room continued around them, but it no longer filled the space. It simply existed within it, like a background that no longer demanded attention. She drew a slow breath, deeper than before, and her shoulders settled into a position that felt natural rather than constructed, the tension that had once defined her posture now replaced with something quieter, something more grounded. Her eyes moved briefly to the chair beside him, the one she had reached for with certainty, and now it looked different, not like something she had lost, but something she had misunderstood. She took a small step forward, not toward the chair, but toward the space between them, closing the distance just enough to shift the dynamic without forcing it. Then I will correct it, she said, her voice calm, steady, not elevated, not diminished, simply clear, and the words did not sound like a performance, they sounded like a decision. The room remained still, but the stillness now carried a different kind of weight, not tension, not expectation, but attention, the kind that recognized the significance of what was happening without needing to react to it. Victoria turned slightly, her gaze moving across the table, meeting the eyes of those who had remained silent, and there was no defensiveness in her expression, no attempt to justify or soften what had already been done. I walked in and made a judgment, she continued, her tone even, each word placed with care, based on what I thought I understood. She paused briefly, not for effect, but because the truth of the statement deserved space to exist fully before she moved past it. And I was wrong. The sentence landed quietly, but it carried through the room with clarity, not because it was loud, but because it was unguarded. No one interrupted. No one looked away. The acknowledgement settled into the space and held. Victoria's gaze returned to Marcus, and for the first time, there was no distance left in the way she looked at him, no assumption, no filter, only recognition of who he was and what she had failed to see. "I did not ask," she said, her voice softer now, not weak, but stripped of anything unnecessary, "and I should have." Her hands remained at her sides, relaxed, no longer reaching for control, no longer holding on to anything that needed to be defended. The room did not shift, but something within it aligned more clearly, like a lens coming into focus after being slightly off. Marcus watched her, his expression unchanged, but there was a quiet depth in his gaze now, something that acknowledged the moment without elevating it, without turning it into something larger than it needed to be. He did not interrupt her. He did not respond yet. He allowed her to finish, to fully step into what she had chosen to say. Victoria glanced once more at the chair, then back at him, and this time, the movement held no hesitation. She reached out, not to take it, but to straighten it, aligning it carefully with the table, the motion small, deliberate, almost symbolic, and then she stepped back, leaving it exactly where it belonged. The action was quiet, but it spoke clearly enough on its own. She did not sit. She did not claim the space. She simply returned it. Around the table, the others remained still, but their stillness now felt resolved, not because something had been corrected externally, but because something internal had shifted into place. Victoria drew another slow breath, her posture steady, her presence no longer defined by control, but by awareness. When she spoke again, her voice carried that same clarity, that same grounded tone. "If you are ready," she said, meeting Marcus's gaze without hesitation, "we can begin when you choose." The sentence was simple, but it marked a complete change in alignment, not just in words, but in intention. Marcus held her gaze for a moment, and in that pause, there was no tension, no need to test or confirm anything further. The moment had already revealed what it needed to. His fingers moved slightly against the table, then stilled, and he gave a small nod, acknowledging not just her words, but the shift behind them. The room seemed to settle fully then, like something had clicked into place without sound, without force, just quietly, naturally. Victoria remained where she was, no longer trying to lead, no longer trying to correct, simply present, aligned with the moment as it now existed. And for the first time, the room felt ready. Marcus did not speak immediately, and that silence did not feel empty. It felt complete, like the final note of something that had already resolved itself before anyone needed to explain it. His gaze moved across the room slowly, not surveying, not asserting, but acknowledging, each person at the table meeting that quiet recognition without needing to respond. The air no longer carried tension, only a steady stillness, the kind that comes when something important has settled into place without force. Victoria remained standing where she was, her posture balanced, her hands at her sides, no longer reaching for anything, no longer holding on to anything, simply present in the space as it now existed. The chair beside him remained aligned with the table, untouched, no longer a symbol of assumption, but a quiet reminder of what had shifted. Marcus's fingers moved slightly against the surface, a soft, almost imperceptible motion, and then he leaned forward just enough to begin, not with authority, not with declaration, but with clarity. "Let us begin," he said, his voice calm, even, carrying naturally through the room without effort. And this time, the words did not need to establish control, they simply marked the moment as it was. Around the table, movement returned, subtle at first, a tablet waking from sleep, a pen lifting from the page, a folder opening with a soft sound that did not break the stillness but moved within it. The meeting started not with urgency, but with alignment, each action following the next without hesitation, without confusion. Victoria watched for a moment, then stepped toward an empty chair along the side of the table, not the one she had reached for before, but one that did not carry the same weight, and she took her seat quietly, without drawing attention, without reclaiming anything, just joining the room as it was. Her movements were measured, but no longer controlled in the same rigid way. They flowed more naturally now, grounded in awareness rather than assumption. Marcus began outlining the agenda, his tone steady, clear, focused on the work rather than the moment that had just passed. And there was something deliberate in that choice, something that did not ignore what had happened, but did not hold on to it either. The discussion moved forward, ideas exchanged, decisions considered, and the rhythm of the meeting settled into something familiar, something productive, but beneath it, there was a subtle difference, a clarity that had not been there before. Victoria listened more than she spoke, her attention sharp, not to assert, but to understand, and when she did contribute, her voice carried a different quality, not softened, not reduced, but aligned with the tone of the room, respectful, precise, grounded. At one point, Marcus glanced in her direction as she finished a point, and their eyes met briefly. No tension, no lingering weight from before, just a quiet acknowledgement of the space they now shared. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and continued without pause, and that moment passed as naturally as it had come. The light from the windows shifted slightly as time moved forward, casting a softer glow across the table, reflecting off the glass surface in a way that felt warmer than before, less clinical, more human. The sounds of the room, the turning of pages, the quiet exchange of voices, the subtle movement of chairs, all blended into a rhythm that no longer felt strained. Victoria's hand rested lightly on the table, her fingers no longer tracing the edge, no longer grounding herself, because she no longer needed to. She was already steady. Marcus continued, guiding the conversation with the same calm presence he had held from the beginning, not elevating himself, not diminishing anyone else, simply maintaining the balance that had allowed the room to settle. And as the meeting moved toward its conclusion, there was no dramatic shift, no final statement that needed to redefine anything, because everything that mattered had already been understood. When the last point was addressed and the final note was made, Marcus closed the folder in front of him gently, the soft sound marking the end without announcing it, and the room followed naturally, chairs shifting slightly, papers gathered, devices dimmed. Victoria remained seated for a moment longer, her gaze resting on the table, on the reflection of the light, and then she looked up, her expression calm, clear, no trace of the earlier tension remaining, only a quiet awareness of what had changed. She stood, not quickly, not hesitantly, just at the right moment, and as she turned to leave, her eyes met Marcus's one last time. There was no need for words, no need to revisit anything that had already been resolved. She gave a small nod, subtle, genuine, and he returned it in kind, just as quietly. She walked toward the door, her steps measured, no longer echoing with the same sharp certainty as before, but carrying a steadiness that felt more real, more grounded. The door opened, then closed softly behind her, and the room remained as it was, calm, aligned, unchanged in structure, but not in meaning. Marcus remained seated for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the table, his gaze steady, not following her, not holding on to the moment, simply present. The light shifted again across the surface, catching the edge of the chair beside him, still perfectly aligned. And nothing needed to be said,